I've been working on the railroad all the livelong day. I've been working on the railroad just to pass the time away. And you hear the whistle blowing, rise up so early in the morning. Can't you hear the captain shouting, Dinah, blow your horn. Dinah, won't you blow, Dinah, won't you blow, Dinah, won't you blow your horn. Dinah, won't you blow, Dinah, won't you blow, Dinah, won't you blow your horn. Someone's in the kitchen with Dinah, someone's in the kitchen, I know. Someone's in the kitchen with Dinah.
When you were a kid, did you ever read the classic Scottish adventure story Treasure Island? Maybe you saw one of the swashbuckling movies. As you probably remember, the tale's about a lost map to a pirate treasure. When you find that map and figure it out, you can go where the treasure's buried and you can dig it up. Well, that's what happened to me 2 years ago, and it took place right here, out among the wheat fields and the creeks that run all the way down from a towering spur of the Blues, which is called Blalock Mountain, to the banks of the muddy Walla. Take a look at this picture. You can see here, this is the side of Blalock Mountain, and it's a couple of friends of mine, and we're hiking up there when this adventure got started. Now, the map I found was also lost and buried, but it was buried among the thousands of a century-and-a-half old Baker family documents that are stashed away in the vaults of the Eels Northwest Archives at Whitman College. That's only a couple of hundred yards from the location of the 1855 Treaty Council that led to Indian Wars, but also the founding of our town, Walla Walla, then the building of railroads that connected it with the outside world. The treasure turned out, in fact, to be buried in those wheat fields, and it's made of metal, still solid today, and more lasting than the greenback dollars that paid for it in 1879. It's a treasure, on one side, similar in appearance to the heads of coins, still looking just the way they did when the heads were hammered down by railroad spikers. But on the other side, the long tails were driven through wooden ties cut from the old growth forest way up on that same Blalock Mountain. How much is the treasure that we found worth? Well, we're going to show you what we found. When it was laid down in 1879, it was valuable enough to open the whole southern half of the Walla Walla Valley and the hills of Weston to the logging that would build our homes and our stores and our houses of learning, worship, and pleasure. It also generated long, high heaps of piled up gold, something that looked like it and was worth near as much. Heaps that were whisked off to the Columbia and down the river to market, leaving a trail that filled up lots of bookkeeping ledgers on farms, businesses, and at banks. Well, what was the treasure's name? Well, it's the Blue Mountain Extension to Dorsey Singh Baker's Walla Walla and Columbia River Railroad. How I stumbled on that map and managed to sleuth out how and why the railroad was built, and then what it took to dig it up, is a pretty good story, I think. In fact, there's a whole book about it. A book available at the Fort Walla Walla Museum gift shop. So you can take a look at the front of the book, and the back you can see on the front, on the right, you have the railroad engine, which was called the Blue Mountain, and then on the left you see another engine, and you see a great big curve that is at the top of Dry Creek, which is a place we'll be talking quite a bit about. But there's something else in addition to the book I'm going to tell you about today, and that's the long series of questions that got me hooked, reeling me in one after another until I finally got to the answers that explained a lot of mysteries. Sherlock Holmes, Father Brown, and Secrets of the Dead can move over. And while in my mind I was riding the crest of the Dry Creek in flood in the 1870s, I got a close-up and personal look at several people from that time, and I could see them caught up with me there in that decade's raging torrent of railroad construction. One you probably think you know all about. So that's D.S. Baker, Walla Walla's premier banker. But what motive, which is now lost in the mists of time, led him to leap into such a risky and expensive, on his own, financial adventure, building a railroad? If you visited the campus of the University of Oregon, you may recall seeing Villard Hall. And that's somebody else I got to know. Henry Villard, a German immigrant with an assumed French name and a genius for finance. He came here to buy out Baker, and he built a lot of infrastructure all the way from Milton Freewater over to Dayton. And you can tell that he comes from a German aristocratic family, as we'll be hearing a little bit later. The most loquacious and the best storyteller is Jack Cartwright. So here's Jack. That's the only photo we have of him. You can tell that he didn't hang out with ambassadors and dukes. He was a working man. He helped build the railroad, and then he was the engineer and the fireman on a lot of runs on the Blue Mountain extension. But he did have a lot of admiration for Villard. He himself was an immigrant from England, and he worked first for Baker and then for Villard, as I said, for an engineer and a fireman. Cartwright's memories and his yarns give us all the nitty-gritty details and the occasional shenanigans of the train crews when they were building both the Walla Walla and Columbia River Road, which was the first one from the Columbia River up to Walla Walla, and then its extension, the Blue Mountain. And those memories were published in Spokane newspapers about a century ago, but really they've been almost unnoticed here in the Walla Walla area. I also got to know two people who also deserve to be better known than they are. That's John Boyer. He was the banking partner of Dorsey Baker. He was the pillar of his college, Whitman, and his church, St. Paul's. As you can see, he was definitely someone who knew how to manage money. In addition, we have a picture here of the other person who comes into this story, and he is E.C. Burlingame. He is the area's irrigation canal pioneer. He lived and worked out in the wheat fields during most of his life, which lasted 100 years, and he even talked himself into a partnership with Boyer. Now, in addition to these historic individuals, my research also enabled me to make the acquaintance of several current old-timers, now in their 90s, out in the Milton Freewater area where I live. I enjoyed talking with and harvesting their memories while they're still on the vine. Two of these old-timers stand out. One is Orville Potter, and he is still on his own there in his farm at Triangle Station. He worked up on Blalock Mountain in the mid-20th century. Back then, he got the same obsession that was to overcome me many decades later, to track down local railroad-related history, even on that exceedingly steep mountain. And last but far from least, because of her sharp mind and her straight tongue, was Ruth Renken, who's the next farm over from my son-in-law's family down at State Line. Her parents moved into the area in the early 20th century, giving their name to the road out front, which is still there. Her memories helped fill in gaps in the curious story of Whitmans Station versus Whitman Junction, a mystery which we'll get into. All right, now I think we've filed up the boiler and we brought the loco up to steam. The first a question that appeared to the Sherlock in me not too many years ago, after I had played James McAuliffe for many years, right at the Fort Walla Walla Living History Museum, was the location of an early sawmill. McAuliffe was a man who was 11 times elected mayor, and he once owned 460-acre wheat farms and a thriving lumber yard. I wanted to get the backstory on a brief newspaper report that his high-producing steam-powered sawmill in the Blue Mountains, somewhere about 20 miles south of town, had partially burned down, but was still considered a total financial loss. Now, I, being ignorant about sawmills, thought it would be fascinating to visit the ruins of that sawmill. A visit to the Umatilla County Courthouse in Pendleton showed that McAuliffe never owned land on Blalock Mountain, but rather in 3 places on nearby Weston Mountain. I made a trip to Weston Public Library. I had a chat with a knowledgeable old rancher that I met there, and then I made an excursion up into the woods on the mountain, but I turned up no trace of the sawmill. It took me correspondence with the sawmill expert at the High Desert Museum in Bend to make me see I'd been chasing a restless ghost, because when sawmills chewed through the trees in the area around them, they were sold and moved on to new woods. Then I got lucky. A neighbor of mine had written a college research paper and found a rare book published by the Hopkins family. They were the first to homestead up on Blalock Mountain, and that in turn brought me to the farm door of Orville Potter. 75 years earlier, Bobby Harris, one of the young men in the legendary Harris family of Harris Park and Harris Pine Furniture fame, had told Orville about how one of Blalock's big steam boilers for a sawmill had been dragged up there by farmers' oxen a foot at a time, 2,200 feet, up to the head of Flume Canyon up on top of Blalock Mountain. Orville took to spending all his time off hunting for it, in every glen and on every ridge. The memories of his quest were contagious, and I too became fascinated by that hidden mountain and visited restaurant owner Pat Kelly, who lives up the North Fork of the Walla Walla River, and he still runs cattle way up on Blalock beyond the locked gate. From him I got permission to hike up Flume Canyon, then tried to get to the top that way. My neighborhood gas station attendant had insisted pieces of the old Flume were still there in the canyon. Orville, though, said they were obliterated to build a road during World War II, and I think he's right. When the going was too rocky to go higher, I rounded up a few friends and we successfully made the demanding climb east of Harris Park. So here's the picture you saw in the advertisement for this talk, and it looks steep, and that is exactly what it looks like when you're up there. It was an amazing experience to climb up. The view, as I say, was breathtaking. There are dense stands of old trees. The pheasants are the size of pterodactyls, and there are lots of old logging buildings. So let's take a look. This first one is the oldest cabin, and that goes back over 100 years. In addition, you see another cabin, probably from the earlier 20th century, and the tail of the dog I was with going in there. And finally, this interesting piece of old logging machinery is sort of their pride and joy up there, and this was used to haul entire big trees to where they could be processed. We couldn't find any remains of Blalock's sawmills or the Flume. Everything up there had come later. Then the lumber company manager, who was carrying a rifle suitable for elephant hunts, found us, greeted us, and politely ordered us off the mountain. Before long, after sighting an immense herd of elk and the bear with 2 cubs, it was dark, my flashlight burned out, and I got separated from my companions. It looked like I was going to have to spend the October night on that rocky and precipitous slope. Fortunately, my friends found me, went for a flashlight, and rescued me. I settled finally for writing a long article for the Union Bulletin about the early history of the mountain. I was cured of Blalock fever, or wouldn't you think? But then another old-timer told me that there never was a flume that got closer to Milton Freewater than the mouth of its canyon, Flume Canyon, where it meets the banks of the South Fork. There, the logs that had been sawn up on top were just thrown into the river and floated down, taken out somewhere. So, by fatal attraction, I felt compelled to discover if the town legend that Blalock had constructed a timber flume all the way down the South Fork had any basis in fact. Now, I've never found out, but there's sure no trace of one, and I don't think so. The family history, written by the homesteaders, says the father drove the lumber in a wagon, and the steel wheels crunched on the snow in the winter, leaving from a camp at a log dump, a camp complete with a school, located near the place that Indians called the Bear's Nose, the place where Blalock Mountain ends at the confluence of the North and South Forks of the Walla. I thought the best way to get a handle on the route of the flume after it came down Flume Canyon, assuming that there had been such a flume, would be to look up the route of Baker's Railroad extension out toward Milton Freewater. But what I found was that nobody knew where that train had run. There remains an old school building, originally used for the children of the workers who took the logs off of the flume, or off of some waterway, and they lived nearby. That building has recently been converted into a winery. It's about 4.5 miles west of Milton Freewater, but records show it had been moved some distance from its original site, and whatever that first location is, we don't know. Maybe, I speculated, the flume's route was later used by one of the early irrigation canals that spread out westward from the town. With that thought, I had a ticket to ride in my mind, and I did a pretty thorough inventory of the box of old maps stashed away at the Watermaster's office in Milton. That search was educational, but no flume. So at that point, I might say I staggered to my corner, a little bit like a boxer, feeling somewhat thrashed, but my curiosity, acting like my trainer, gave me a pep talk, and I agreed to weave and bob my way through another round of this overtime match with the Blalock flume. So I picked up the lost thread of the railroad's path, weaved my way to the Northwest Archives at Whitman College, and started interrogating Dorsey S. Baker himself. As a colleague of his once wrote, he had an instinct for making money. He knew that keeping daily records of all deals and projects had to be a big part of his game. Going through his diaries and his business journals, what should I discover but that he had sold to Doc Blalock, on credit, for use on the mountain, the same sawmill that he had constructed at the mouth of the Walla River to supply the lumber to build his famous rawhide railroad from Wallula to Walla. We'll talk about that in a minute. The saw blade he sold to Blalock had a few teeth missing, but he threw into the deal an obscure tool for making horseshoes, and I'm still waiting to find out what that was about. Blalock, who had a very different personality, spent so much money in wages for local people who were building his flume down the mountain that he ended up losing thousands of dollars. But he paid back the loan from Dorsey in full and with interest, very slowly, but honestly and steadily over several years. So the banker wrung every last dollar out of that big worn-out saw blade. Now that's financial instinct. Still, that didn't answer my question about the route of the Flume and the railroad, so I kept on digging in the archives, and I did hit the mother lode. In a file not labeled Baker material, up a side track, so to speak, there it was, a 19th century railroad map, clearly drawn by a surveyor on some antique kind of paper I had never seen before. It showed all the section lines so you could figure out exactly where the tracks ran, even though there wasn't much built out in the hills at that time. That was 1879. Fortunately, Walla Walla, Milton, Weston, and Centerville, and that's what they called Athena then, were clearly drawn, and they were marked on the map. The next step, reading Baker's diaries from 1875 to 1880, turned out to be a vivid experience. I could follow on the newly rediscovered map the places where the construction was progressing day by day in his diaries. The surveyor was Mr. P. Zahner, who laid out the whole route for Dorothy. For a while, he was the county surveyor for Walla Walla. So let's take a look. So what you see here, this is the top section of the map. And at the top is a place called Whitman, and that's up near the Whitman Mission. We'll see on another map later. And then the railroad, this is what they planned to do and what they pretty much did. Went south from there, had to make a cut through the hills down near Valley Chapel, ran along through the hill country, and then finally down south through the flat fruit growing area. But instead of going to Milton, off here to the lower right, they didn't want to climb the Milton Hill. So instead, they went on south and picked up the lower end of Dry Creek and followed that on up until they got close to Weston. And now here, the next picture, you can see the lower half, the southern half of this route, and you can see the railroad there at the top coming up Dry Creek. And then when it gets to the head of Dry Creek, where Dry Creek gets steep, it makes that very sharp hairpin turn, and very slowly following more or less the contour, climbing gradually, makes that big turn, and it was designed to go right up to Weston. But it never made it that far, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. It stopped there at the head of Dry Creek. I wanted to show you this big bend at the top of Dry Creek, and you'll see a big trestle there. If you look at that picture, you'll see a dirt road running in front of it. Today that's paved. That's the highway going from Milton Freewater up to Weston. Now that's paved, and where that trestle is still there. That trestle has been covered up with dirt and rocks. Here's another picture of it. This was taken when the trestle was still there also. It's got a couple of local people standing up on top. You can imagine how far down that looked to them. And the map held another and bigger surprise. The line, which Dorothy called the Blue Mountain Extension, didn't ever join the Walla Walla and Columbia River Railroad at the place which maps today label Whitmans Station. That's the place where Walla Walla 2020, a local history group, naturally assuming that that was the point of junction, has placed a historical marker. On this map, here's Whitmans Station, which is off here on the upper left-hand side. And then you see a railroad line called the Union Pacific, and that is running along the same place that Dorsey Baker's railroad ran from the Columbia up to Walla Walla. And you'll see the Whitman Mission is in between those two places. Now, where I've drawn a red circle and put a number 1, that's where the map showing where the Blue Mountain Extension was, that's where that ran. That's where it was located. Now, the map, read in conjunction with the diaries and the newspaper accounts from 1875, make it clear that Whitmans Station did in fact exist, but it was a very temporary one for passenger service out by the mission before Dorsey S. could raise the money to complete the line from Wallula to Walla Walla. Passengers coming from the south in Oregon even had to cross the river in a boat to get to it. And you can see on this map where it says Blue Mountain Boys Ranch, which is not there anymore. It's now called something else, but where you have a bridge over there now, at that point it was just a rowboat. The real end of the line at the time was about 2 miles farther east, over smoother terrain heading south in the basin of the Little Walla Walla River. That's where that one in the circle is. There, farmers from the Weston and Milton areas brought their wheat by wagon for shipment down to the Columbia River and piled it up. The place was called Weston. Why? Because so many farmers from Weston brought their crops to it. Ruth Rankin remembers clearly hearing about it, that it was a railroad maintenance yard that was always east of Whitmans Station. The building at Whitmans Station was soon abandoned, and the railroad, following its usual practice, renamed Weston as Whitman Junction, since the mission was still the nearest landmark and the Whitman passenger station no longer existed. At least not as a train depot. But locals used it as a point of reference. The marriage license for Ruth Rankin's parents shows the wedding is happening at Whitman's Station, but she's convinced it happened in somebody's house, not out on the railroad siding. She also remembers seeing for many years that rowboat tied up there in the river. While struggling to raise the money from folks in Walla Walla to complete the tracks from Wallula to Walla Walla, Baker threatened them with turning the route due south at Whitman Junction and heading straight for the town of Weston, not to Walla Walla at all. That threat, along with the urgent need that the farmers had for a rail link to the Columbia, worked for him. But 4 years later, he did build that second line. He knew there were countless future customers out there waiting for it. The timetable and a list of shipping prices in 1880 testifies to it. So let's take a look at this next picture. Here we have a list of the train schedule, and you can see we have two different runs. The top one starts at Walla Walla, goes to Whitman Junction, then it goes up straight toward the Columbia to Touchy, goes by 9 Mile Tank, which was water for the train, of course, now 9 Mile Ranch, and went into Wallula. And then there was also a train right below it from Walla Walla through Whitman Junction, turning south, it's going down to State Line. That's right on the border, Oregon and Washington, and there was a station there called Baker House, but we haven't been able to find any remains of it, so we're still hoping on that one. From there it went to Milton, which actually was 4 miles west, of course, at the Milton log dump, and from there up to the Blue Mountain Station at the end of the line at that point. All right, then another question came to my mind and demanded to be answered. Is there any cold steel evidence for the Blue Mountain extension out there on the land? Randy Reese, good friend, neighbor on my street, as well as the curator of the old Milton Cemetery, is a skilled and enthusiastic finder of historical artifacts using his metal detector. With a copy of Dorsey's map in hand, he picked out a spot not likely to have been disturbed since the tracks were pulled up in 1883 to make way for a standard gauge route that ran directly through Milton and hooked up with a line coming over from Pendleton. So Randy chose a swell, a little valley on the Knowles farm, where the map showed the tracks coming up a draw from the Little Walla Walla River, then making a sharp left turn south along a little valley never disturbed by the building of a road. Bingo. A few hours later, he found a narrow gauge railroad spike just a few feet west of the route shown on the map. It was the right distance to have been tossed aside when the track removal was done. The Knowles were thrilled. At the bend of the line where it intersected with the draw, he found something much more massive and requiring his robust strength to unearth it. A couple of feet beneath the surface there was, and still is, a large bundle of coiled up barbed wire, exactly the type used in the 1880s. Tracks, of course, had fences that were made to keep animals off. You may have heard that Dorsey's first mile of track from Wallula, first 10 miles I think, had used a dog who rode at the front of the locomotive on a platform to jump off and drive away cattle and deer that could be seen on the tracks ahead. Let's take a look again at the back cover of the book, and it might be a little hard to see, but on the upper left hand side you see a locomotive. This one, not the Blue Mountain, but this was one probably taken in about that same time down at Pasco. And if you look closely, and when you get the book, you'll see there's a platform right in front and there is a dog sitting on it. Randy's next stop was getting permission to metal detect at Whitman Junction, which shows up on Baker's map a few feet from where now Last Chance Road crosses the Union Pacific line that has replaced the Rawhide Railroad. Didn't take long for more narrow gauge spikes to turn up there, and a couple of them were headed off to the south along the route of the Blue Mountain extension. The map and the diaries are explicit about that being the site of the maintenance yard for all the rolling stock and the engines, plus a Y-shaped pair of short tracks for turning the engines around. And if we look at that picture, I've blown up the section where it shows Whitman. You'll see where the buildings were, and you can see the two short tracks that form a Y there. Since Dorsey was highly frugal, he had his workers make the cars. He built them himself right there. And in confirmation of that, Randy detected a fragment of a gaslight fixture from a building there he can show to you. We even have a detail from the diaries of a rail worker falling off a ladder while he was doing construction at the site. Randy bagged other apparently railroad-related items. Some are more convincingly narrow-gauge railroad than others. But he worked his way south, getting permissions, talking to longtime farming families, and he went on detecting right on through the winter. I myself got lucky being directed to Zerba Accounting in Milton Freewater, where they have a copy of an interview conducted in 1933 with E.C. Burlingame that we saw at the beginning. Now in California he had learned to build a new and very important kind of technology, irrigation canals, and then he built them in some places here in the Northwest. John Boyer, treasurer of Whitman College, a strong supporter of St. Paul's School for Girls, was a brother-in-law of Dorsey Baker, and as I mentioned, his business partner. Boyer had formed a partnership with two men in the Milton Freewater area to build a canal from the Little Walla Walla River west to the new farming area of Gardena down by Touchy. They had a route surveyed that went north all the way around the line of hills at the Whitman Mission, but they hired Burlingame to check it. As the future king of irrigation in our area told the story, he perceptively observed that there is a draw running west from the Little Walla Walla, then up and through a gap in the ridge to emerge into the drainage of Mud Creek, and from there on down to Gardena, thereby saving many miles of canal building and evaporation. The three established partners were so impressed, they made him the fourth partner, and his fortune was launched. Although not until he put in several years overseeing the digging of what he called the Big Cut. But Baker's map provided me with an aha moment by revealing that Burlingame was not the first to make use of that draw to get up over the ridge. And that's precisely where the surveyor Zahner ran the Blue Mountain extension. Those tracks had only been gone 9 or 10 years when Burlingame saw the site. Some traces of the grading and the smoothing would have remained. The question was, how much did Burlingame know? My friend Glenn Morrison grew up at Valley Chapel, right next to the cut. And after my book came out, he told me that as a boy he had heard stories about Doc Baker's railroad going up it. So Burlingame may not have been as exceptionally perceptive as it seemed, or the cut for the canal quite as much in need of earth moving and shaping. Let's get back to that mysterious flume off of Blalock Mountain. Through the kindness of a friend, I got lucky again. Donna Cummins came upon and sent to me a long article in the Walla Statesman newspaper about an entirely forgotten flume. A flume coming down the practically vertical north side of Blalock Mountain, not on the south side. The article from about 1880 convinces me that the earlier flume coming down the mountain on the south side through Flume Canyon never did go beyond the banks of the South Fork of the Walla River. Blalock, to get the lumber down and over the flats to the spot where Baker was going to build his new railroad, built a second flume that ran parallel to the North Fork of the river and over to the west to what was called the log dump, today renamed Pleasant View. But that winter of 1880, the rains came hard. Very soon, the new flume collapsed in several places and became unusable. Still, other newspaper accounts demonstrate that the flume, some flume, moved a high volume of lumber off of the mountain down to Pleasant View and then sent it off to Walla on that railroad. And it did it for a full 10 years, from 1880 to 1890. So the driving question in my mind became, how did that happen? Thanks to Donna and a 19th century newspaper editor who made an overnight excursion to the construction site in a tent camp on the north side, where hundreds of workers from Milton and the area lived for the duration of the project, a third flume was constructed. Well, who did that? So enter the financial wizard Henry Villard, the German immigrant with a French name and a genius for finance. His story is frankly astonishing, but in the interest of brevity, I'll just tell you that when he wanted to raise cash on Wall Street, he needed only announce that people could send in their money immediately, and he would tell them later what they had bought. A railroad historian has written that Villard issued big dividends to stockholders using money he saved by not maintaining the tracks or the equipment on his mini railroads. That made it easy to sell the stock at inflated prices. Assuming that's right, he bought out Baker and the steamship company, though Dorothy retained 1/6 interest in the railroad to be able to stay personally involved in bossing the construction of the Blue Mountain extension. Villard owned a coal mine here in the Northwest, and he decided to buy a railroad to distribute his product, and which he could, of course, use to take care of stoking the locos. You know, locos, that's what their owners called locomotives. He called that arrangement the Oregon Improvement Company, and as Susan Monahan can tell you, they had an office right here in Walla on Main Street. To enlarge his control of the region's infrastructure, he thereby improved it. He built a lumber flume at Dayton to get the wood down to his train, just as he did at Milton after buying out Doc Blalock. His head engineer, a German named Thielmann, for whom a mountain in Oregon is named, knew how to construct high-quality flumes that lasted. A big admirer of Villard's was the last person we're talking about almost, that's Jack Cartwright. the Englishman who both drove and fired the locos in the Walla Walla Valley. He had a gift for eloquence, and he was like his boss that way. And when he retired to Spokane, he retained the ability to retain details that add rich human interest to the history of our local narrow gauges. I remember one yarn about an inspection trip that Villard made up to Blue Mountain Station, which of course was the southernmost end of the line. At the end of the day, Villard said to an engineer, "Henry, give us a ride back to Walla Walla." And they roared back down the foothills at top speed, with the owner remarking, "Pretty good for a rawhide road." Cartwright is unsurpassed for recreating the fatigue of wrestling wood and dirt and steel into place to make an iron road, and the flavor, the savor of hijinks perpetrated by the crew members, especially in the winter, when they had plenty of time to cook up dances with local girls or to spend the night going from bar to bar. Cartwright was sharp-witted and observant, laughing at how Baker calmed farmers who were eager to get their harvest to market by offering freight prices for expensive fast wheat and cheaper slow wheat, when all the wheat went on the same train. And he, along with Baker's son-in-law, M.C. Moore, who was the last Washington territorial governor, are the only two people I found who explained in writing the real reason why the banker gambled desperately, economizing to the max, to be able to pay the costs of building the so-called Rawhide Railroad, which at first had to be made affordable by using wooden rails. The whole thing had to do less with stimulating business in the area than with not losing all his investments in his own earlier steamship company. A competitor had put that line out of business by using its connections in the U.S. Congress. Does that sound bizarre? Well, stay tuned for details at 11, or if you can't wait for that, they're on page 21 in the book. Randy walked around for several days in Pleasant View trying to find where the log dump was that had occasioned the building of the dump school, of which Randy is a graduate. He hasn't found it yet, and a related mystery remains. When the standard gauge line went through Milton in '83, where did it meet the Villard-Thielsen Flume, creating a new log dump? No one in Milton Freewater had even remembered the existence of a third flume down the north side of Blalock. So logically, much less where it ended. Some of the locals think the flume went down Mill Street, which is 1 block to the east of Maine. But, as Buddy Holly famously said, maybe, baby. In any case, if we want to know how and why we got where we are today, there is buried treasure nearby, especially with old newspapers sprouting up to be harvested in cyberspace as thick as the annually blooming camas in the Blue Mountains. I hope you'll all go out, not just online, and find that historic soul food for yourself. To help you do that, I recommend Dan Clark's very complete book on all the historical sites and markers throughout the Walla Walla Valley. Like my book, it is available in the museum gift shop. Now, Randy Reese is going to inspire you to move into action by showing you what his search along the route of the Blue Mountain extension discovered. Randy.
I used pretty much a metal detector out in the field. These iron artifacts are really easy to find if you get the coil over the artifact. It's just you have to cover a lot of territory because they're far and few between. Little narrow gauge spikes. These are the very original spikes that nailed the rails down to the ties. Narrow gauge dog spikes. The head looks a little like a dog's head. They have little ears, and that actually facilitated removal. They expected that they would be reused. And just as a size reference, this is a modern spike. I just pulled this off of a rail close by the modern trains run on, and you can see the size difference between the two. These little guys were pretty small. And I found these spikes just east of Last Chance Road, heading south from where the Blue Mountain extension teed off of the main railroad. I found this hammer south of Yuma Pine Highway. It was kind of almost in line with Pleasant View School, where we thought that the line ran, and that's why I was there trying to find artifacts. And the hammer was intriguing to me. It's worn on the top edge of the one face, and to me it looked like it was most likely used to strike the spikes as they were to hold the rail, and you wanted to pull the hammer back to keep from hitting the rail as you came down in to nail the spike to the rail. What else did we have? The part of a gas lamp. It's a brass wall gas lamp. Some of the iron piping is still there, but it's all bent. But it would have had a glass globe on it, and it would have piped in gas, and it would have been a wall light in a house. It's kind of decorative. It has a fleur-de-lis design on it, and it was along the route of that extension there by Last Chance Road.
Strumming on the old banjo, singing fee-fi, fiddly-I-O, fee-fi, fiddly-I-O, fee-fi, fiddly-I-O, strumming on the old banjo. Now you may think that there ain't no more. Now you may think that there ain't no more. You may think that there ain't no more, well there ain't.
Okay, so there's that. Thank you. And we have Clark ready now to answer questions live from the museum. So Clark, can you hear me?
Yeah, I'd like to just point out a couple of things. It's fun to see the actual locomotive called the Blue Mountain that you saw pictures of. Now this is what's left of it, and it's now out in front of the museum here in Walla Walla. So that is the Blue Mountain locomotive that Jack Cartwright rode on and ran for all those years. What happened to that engine? There's some debate, but the main idea seems to be that Dorsey Baker then went on, built another railroad up Mill Creek. And he had built a flume up there too, even though that one washed out pretty soon. So where did that railroad go? That locomotive went up there. And now Randy tells me he's found information that the tracks and the spikes, they all went up there too. Then later, it may have worked as a portage railroad down by Celilo Falls. That's the other tradition. Maybe it did both. From there, of course, you may have heard it went to Alaska, worked in the mines before it finally ended back here where it started off. So that is kind of a little footnote. It's fun to see where we were is on that locomotive is where all this happened. So I'm ready to take some questions, and so is Randy.
All right, well, I'll read some off here. From Frank Brown, did this railroad tie in directly to Dorsey Baker's railroad from Walla Walla to Wallula?
Yes, absolutely. You can see on the map, east of Whitman Mission, there's a junction. That's why they called it Whitman Junction. And there are those Y-shaped 2 tracks where they could back into one side of the Y and then go to the other side of the Y and head in the other direction. So that all happened right there. And because they had several buildings, people lived there. The workers boarded out there. We can see that from Jack Cartwright's memoirs. We know that that was an important center. It was, in fact, there was a threat made by Dorsey Baker that if they didn't pay for the money to open up that last section of line into Walla Walla, he just started a town there at Whitman, and then that would be the junction for people who wanted to go south. So yeah, it was definitely a town that's been just about forgotten about.
And we somebody asked, what is a flume?
All right, a flume. This is a, what should we say? It's a trough made out of wood. It was typically V-shaped, and you could run water from the top of the mountain, and they had a pretty good lake up there on top of Blalock Mountain, which is still there. And this V-shaped trough had water running through it coming down the mountain. And so you put the lumber that you sawed up on top, you threw it in there, and then the flume would snake its way down until it got to where it was going. And that means the South Fork of the Walla Walla River. Sometimes it would get clogged, and you get too many boards going through it. So they had people called flume tenders. Sometimes we have pictures from California. The flume tender would live right up halfway down the mountain, and his cabin would be right next to the flume, and he could get out of bed, and in 10 seconds he could be out there trying to push the logs back into where they're supposed to be so that things could keep flowing. There was an accident on the 3rd flume. We know the superintendent of that was bending over the flume in the 1880s to try to clear a log jam when he lost his footing. He fell over the logs and sustained some substantial injuries, although I guess he recovered, but it was a tough job.
I can imagine. All right. Richard Galloway asks, does anything show up on Sanborn maps or perhaps local supply company records? All that should be in the archives, either at one of the universities or state archives.
Okay, Randy, have you been able to find anything?
No.
No. No, we looked at all of the maps that we could for those dates. And no, there doesn't seem to be any record except for this one map that was drawn up by the surveyor Zahner, and then it was used by the team, by Baker's team when they built the road. So there doesn't seem to be any other map aside from this one that they have in the archives at Whitman College.
How much has been spent looking at either aerial photos or satellite images?
All right, so we're going to turn that one over to Randy. Go ahead.
Well, I spent quite a few hours pulling my eyeballs out over maps and satellite photos, looking through the all the different years that they took satellite photos, and just looking at the vegetation, trying to find any discrepancies that would show a pathway or an anomaly that would be in a lineal fashion. I spent hours at the computer and on maps looking for those things.
Okay. Why was the extension route used for such a short period of time?
Because the Transcontinental Railroad system was about to arrive. Henry Villard, who bought out Dorsey, developed an extensive network. He eventually became president, actually fairly soon, of the Northern Pacific. and he was racing to beat out another competing company. He built the final section of the Transcontinental Railroad down the south bank of the Columbia River from Walla down to Portland. But when you have a little section of a railroad 14 miles long and you're getting standard gauge lines coming in around it, yeah, you can't constantly be transferring your merchandise from one gauge to another. So that's why when they actually converted the main branch of the railroad from the Columbia to Walla Walla, I believe in 81. So at that point, they were now thinking that they would need to get a line that they wouldn't have to make transfers of cargo. We also see in the diaries that while switching those cars, doing those transfers, one worker did have a serious injury to his hand. So that was a major factor, the labor and the dangers of doing that. And then the other thing was, you didn't want to have really to take everything from Blue Mountain and from Milton and then go down to this junction by the Mission, take it, and then take it over to Walla Walla, especially if you're transferring it. You wanted one line, and so the line that was completed in 83 went directly from Walla Walla right through the town of Milton, and then went and to Dry Creek, where it picked up the route where the narrow gauge had run. But the time in narrow gauges was limited there because of the getting into the bigger network.
We have a couple questions in the chat also. I'll grab a couple of those. Did the map just go back into the archives? Did it get put into the Baker materials, or has it just been hidden again, or what?
No, it's not hidden. It is right there. You can go look at it. You go to the Northwest Archives at Whitman College Library, and you can ask for Dorsey Baker's map of the Blue Mountain extension. They were very helpful to me, of course, in the archives. They took a lot of the photographs that I've been able to use in my book. So you can go there, see it on that very unusual paper. That red line that you see on the map is the way it is. That's how the surveyor drew it back in the 1870s. So I would invite people to go take a look.
Were there ever passenger trains?
Yes, there were. I was just looking at the train schedule again today with my wife, and we noticed that it shows the schedule for the trains, and it does show passenger service from Walla Walla down to Wallula on the Columbia. But strangely enough, it just shows freight service coming from Blue Mountain and Milton down to Whitman Junction. So I'm not certain if at any point they did have passenger service on the Blue Mountain extension or just on the main line.
Okay.
You have any ideas on that, Randy?
Yeah, I do. I know we found a newspaper article from West on the date they announced that the stagecoach would no longer go straight through from Pendleton to Walla Walla, that it would end at Blue Mountain Station because the new train would take passengers from Blue Mountain Station into Walla Walla. So we know that they obviously took passengers. The stagecoach no longer would run that leg.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, that reminds me, I remember reading a newspaper item from around 1880, 81, about someone who did catch the train out there at the dump, at what we call Pleasant View now. So yeah, there was.
Somebody asks, what again is the name of the book, and is it available on Amazon?
Let's see. I don't think it's available on Amazon. So check with the Fort Walla Walla Museum gift shop. They can get it to you. And it's called Walla Walla's Blue Mountain Railroad in 1879.
What kind of trees were they pulling out? Has the tree line increased up the hill since then?
All right, well, we're having to scratch our head on this one. When you get to the top of a very steep hillside, yeah, it's flat up on top. The trees there have grown back a great deal since they were being cut in the 1870s and the 1880s. They're extremely thick, very, very big. My impression is that that hillside was very steep and very rocky. It still is. I'm not sure it ever did have that much vegetation on it. What would be your take on that one, Randy?
I think the timber was pretty much up on top. I have heard from an old timer that his grandfather ran sheep on the hillside, and there wasn't even very much shrubbery on the hillsides, the steep hillsides. Not much brush even. So the timber is up on top, and I don't know, but what timber harvest in our area might be every 50 years or more, possibly. So on a 50-year cycle, you could probably have harvestable timber.
Who were the builders? Was it immigrants?
All right. And this is, I think, a significant point. I'm not sure I mentioned it, but it's not only in this area, but in California, many places in the country. A lot of the heavy work of particularly grading and scraping the land was done by Chinese workers who were brought in large numbers. Dorsey Baker, in his diaries, talks about how in 1879, he had several China camps, and at each of these camps along the construction route, he would have 30 or 40 Chinese workers, and he hired a special cook for each of these camps. The Chinese, as you may know, were famous for being extremely good workers. They were essential to completing the western part of the Transcontinental Railroad. They ate a healthy diet. They knew how to work hard. They knew how to work together. And they were sort of the motive power that made it possible to blast the way through the Sierras in California and get the land here ready for the track layers who tended to be Irish immigrants or other people. We have the payroll documents from Dorsey, and what we can see is that the payroll for the Chinese workers was a little bit bigger than the payroll to the non-Chinese workers. So they were essential.
Jake Alexander says, my family has a home in Adams, and as a kid I found old railroad wood and small square nails. I've been studying the history of that area, but I'm stuck trying to find an old crossroad or town just outside of Weston. He searched for a bit, but no luck. Is there any historical information with the railroad crossing over old wagon roads?
I don't have anything in that area. I haven't studied any of that area of the rail, although I think it went through or close Centerville.
Athena.
Yeah, I think, but I don't know where the old rail bed was there.
Yeah, that came a little bit later. The rail line didn't connect between Blue Mountain Station, which is close to Milton, and Pendleton, which was, of course, running off in that direction until 1887. So that would be slightly later, and we've been focusing just on that first earliest Blue Mountain extension that didn't get over that far south. So there's a whole area that you might be able to investigate and see what you can find on that section of the road.
from Tom Thompson, do you have any idea of the cross-section dimensions of the flume?
Oh, do we remember that?
No, not at all. I don't.
Of course, it was V-shaped, and I have seen pictures. I included some in one of my articles in the Union Bulletin showing what it was like in California. I would say maybe each side of the V was about 3 feet. I think that's about right. And because they weren't fluming down whole tree trunks, but sawed, rough cut lumber, I think that was probably about right. But I can't guarantee that's right, but that's my sense of it.
How fast would those go down?
Well, that's a tough question. Well, I don't think we know the answer either. It probably depends on how much water was coming down there. I know on the north side of Blalock Mountain, that was the steepest drop. The newspaper editor in 1880 couldn't get over how fast. In fact, that was so steep, they later had a dry chute down there after they weren't using the water anymore. They could still cut lumber on top and just throw it over, and it would fall all the way down to the bottom of the mountain, 1,700 feet on the north side. So I could guess that water was coming down awful fast.
Okay. Let's see. Do you know if the name 9 Mile Canyon was named because that was the distance between Touchy and Wallula by railroad, or another reason? From Tracy Gallen.
Well, I believe that's correct. Of course, they had to take on water every so often, and that was called 9 Mile Tank, is what it shows on the train schedule. So I'm assuming that's got to be 9 miles by rail, and they would figure that in when they decided, well, we got to stop after so many miles to take on water. So I think that's probably right.
For Mary Campbell asked if that YouTube video we just played is available online and what it's called. It's not public on YouTube yet. If you keep an eye on our website, that should be up on there, or our YouTube, Fort Walla Walla Museum YouTube channel within a few days at most.
All right, so what would the name be?
Well, we haven't named it yet. I'm not, probably Museum After Hours, Clark Colahan, Blue Mountain Railroad, something or other like that. Those keywords will get it to you probably.
All right.
Was the wheat, let's see. What current local structures do you think adventurer historians will be searching for in 150 years?
All right, this is an interesting question.
Hadn't even thought.
Boy, that is a good one. Well, you're getting into some more research on trying to learn more about the Blue Mountain Station. There still was a grain silo there. We started working on this, but about a year or two ago, it finally collapsed or burned down. So that is gone. As far as things from the railroad, I don't know. Dayton, which of course was worked into this whole network by Villard, has the oldest train depot in Washington State, and that has been restored. But what will be of interest in a century and a half, I guess we'll just have to think about that one.
Was the wheat hauled up from the south to Wallula, then loaded on boats to go west?
Well, let's see. So the wheat would be brought up from the south on the Blue Mountain Extension, and then it would be then put on to the main railroad, which was running west. down to the Columbia. And when it got there at Wallula, steamboats came by and would take it on board. So there's been some argument about this business of fast wheat and slow wheat. You might think there was some chance that the fast wheat, which was put on the front of the train, might get unloaded first at Wallula and had a better chance of getting onto the train. And maybe the slow wheat in the back might not get unloaded as soon and might have to sit around on the dock at Wallula. However, the talkative Englishman, Jack Cartwright, got a good laugh out of this. He said all of that wheat always ended up on the same boat. It just showed that the people who were selling that wheat were in a hurry to get it to market, and they maybe didn't think it through, check it out quite enough. And there's also the story that one of the merchants in Walla Walla, Schwabacker, would have somebody from Dorsey Baker's operation personally make sure that his merchandise, when it reached Wallula coming into town, would get loaded first and get back to Walla Walla before his competitors' merchandise. So they were very concerned about who got there first.
Let's do 3 more questions to finish up. James Payne says, thank you for doing such a great job rediscovering all this local history. What was your most surprising discovery, and what was the most gratifying thing you documented?
All right. Well, I think for me, discovering this whole little town of Whitman, discovering people boarded there, did all this railroad construction. It was a whole part of this area which has been entirely forgotten about. And then you go there with a metal detector, and you find lots and lots of signs that it really was there. Randy, tell us what more you have found recently down there at the Whitman Junction.
At Whitman Junction, I've more spikes. They're pretty easy to find. I have a new metal detector that's better than my original that I was using, and it's pretty easy to find spikes in a line heading south from the tracks that are there now.
So what would you say, which of the discoveries did you think meant the most to you?
Oh, the one that meant the most to me was finding the narrow gauge spike in the really pretty draw on the Knowles property. It's just alfalfa field out there, and with the map that Clark found with that red line on there, it was just the perfect place to have a narrow spot to try to find where the track was. And finding a leftover spike out there was a really great moment for me. It was the best part of the hunt, finding that.
And I know that for Randy, as a graduate of Pleasant View School, formerly known as the Dump School, there was quite a connection there, because when he was an elementary school student there, the principal told all of the students about the history, as it was known, of the railroad, and that he could contribute to that. He's still hoping to be able to nail down the exact location, learn a little bit about what went on there and how it was important to the development of the southern half of this county. I know that meant a lot to him, and I always feel if you have your roots in a place and you can get back to them, it sort of brings it to life. So for me, that was quite important also.
From Sheila Hagar, any evidence of a spur line leaving Lower Dry Creek headed toward Umapine?
Yes, there was. I'm trying to remember the details. Was that an electric train?
It came along later. Oh,
quite a bit later.
As I understand, it came along later, and there was a repair shop or basically a locomotive cleaning station or something there in Yumapine. And that's just hearsay. And I know people have found portions, or some of my friends have found portions of an old track that ran from Barrett Station out towards Yumapine. But I didn't research any of that. I didn't look for any of it. I just know that it's from hearsay that was there.
An interesting thing, if you take an interest in Pleasant View, another line was put in later from Pleasant View running more directly toward Walla Walla. There's kind of a famous cut through a hillside, and it runs on Sunquist, and then it brings you out to what later was put in. It was sort of a commuter train, a local train that went between Milton and Walla Walla. And if you get out there near, let's see, out west Printing and that area, then you can still see there's a warehouse right across the road from that printing place that was, I believe, a station on that line that connected Milton with Walla Walla. And it's interesting when you're in Milton, there is the old depot that was used for that line, and that connected Pleasant View into the Walla Walla area and right on into Walla Walla. So it's makes you a little nostalgic for the era where you didn't have to have a car. You could get around by railroad.
All right, last question. It sounds like Walla Walla is a great place to find oral histories and people who really like history. Clark, what's your next topic of interest?
Well, as I say, at this point, Randy is going to be continuing to work on the Whitmans Station. So I think for local history, and I am hoping to really develop all of these fascinating accounts that Jack Cartwright gave of the years that he lived here, several years, all the exploits, the interesting things that he did. I was planning on doing that for Living History, which is a great feature of this museum. This year, of course, we can't do that, but next year, I'm going to portray Jack Cartwright, learn more about him, his life in England, why he liked Henry Villard so much, and where did he go? Why did he go up to the Spokane area? And what was it like to be a railroader? He was single all his life. He and his brother were here. And what was it like to be somebody who came to this country and was out here doing all these things on the frontier, which was quite different from what I'm sure he was doing back in England. So I'm hoping to get to know Jack better.
We look forward to that. So a recording of this video and the Q&A, we're going to put that up on our website in a day or two. So go to fwwm.org, and on the top menu, just choose events and down to past event videos, and you can see all this. And while you're there, you might get yourself a membership as well. So Clark and Randy, thank you both so much for doing this. I think we all learned a lot, and it's really fun to see your detective work.
It's fun to share the adventure of what it was like to be sort of getting back in touch with what was going on here so long ago.
All right. Well, I hope to see you all at the museum soon. Have a good night.